12,000 years ago, we made a deal with wheat, and the deal was a scam. We stopped moving. We started farming. And suddenly, we had a brand new problem that we had never faced before in the history of our species. Too many people. When you are a hunter-gatherer, you keep your family small. Maybe 2 or 3 kids max. Why? Because carrying 3 screaming toddlers across a desert while also tracking a deer is an absolute nightmare. You cannot do it. So hunter-gatherer women naturally spaced out their births. They had fewer kids, and they had them later. But when you are a farmer, you want 10 kids. More kids means more hands to pull weeds. More hands to harvest the grain. More hands to haul water from the river. More hands mean more wheat. More wheat means you can feed even more kids. And the cycle continues. We had accidentally triggered a population explosion. Welcome back to the timeline. We are now entering the era of the first cities. Specifically, we are heading to Mesopotamia. The land between 2 rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates. Modern-day Iraq. These rivers were amazing because they flooded every year and left behind super fertile soil. But they were also terrifying because sometimes they flooded too much and destroyed everything you owned. By year 6000 BC, humanity was experiencing its first ever population boom. We were not living in small tribes of 20 to 150 people anymore. We were living in settlements of thousands. 5,000. 10,000. Eventually, 50,000 people crammed into a few square miles. And let me tell you, humans are not naturally designed to live with thousands of strangers. Back in the hunter-gatherer days, your social circle was your tribe. You knew everyone. You knew who was trustworthy. You knew who was a liar. You knew who stole berries. And if someone like Greg caused problems, you had 2 options. You could punch Greg in the face, or you could just move to a different part of the forest and never see Greg again. Problem solved. But in a city, you cannot move. Your house is made of mud bricks that took you weeks to build. Your food is growing in that field over there, and it is not portable. You are stuck. You are stuck with Greg. And Greg is stuck with you. And there are 4,000 other people you also have to deal with, most of whom you have never met and have no reason to trust. This created a crisis. How do you get thousands of strangers to cooperate without murdering each other? This required the greatest invention in human history. The law. But before we got to laws, we had to figure out the basics. How do we organize this chaos? How do we build what I like to call the first ever human anthills? Imagine you are living in a town of 5,000 people in the year 5000 BC. You need water. But water does not just appear. Someone has to dig irrigation ditches from the river to the fields. That is a massive project. You need hundreds of people working together for weeks. You also need to store the grain somewhere safe. You need silos. You need guards to protect those silos because the neighboring town is also starving, and they are looking at your wheat with very hungry eyes. You cannot just have a vibe-based government anymore. You cannot just sit around the fire and talk things out. You need structure. You need hierarchy. You need a boss. This is the birth of the king. But here is the problem. How do you convince 5,000 people to listen to one guy? Why should they? What makes him so special? You cannot just say, "I am in charge because I said so." That does not work. People will laugh at you. Or worse, they will stab you and take your stuff. So you need a better story. You need to make the king seem inevitable, unchallengeable, divine. This is where we see the rise of organized religion as a tool of government. The king was not just a guy with a fancy hat. He was the guy who talked to the gods. He had a direct line to the divine. He told the people, "The storm god told me that if we do not dig this irrigation ditch, he will flood the city and drown us all." And because everyone was terrified of the storm god, they dug the ditch. No questions asked. Religion was not just about belief anymore. It was about control. It was about getting people to cooperate on a massive scale by making them think that the universe itself demanded their obedience. It was brilliant. It was also terrifying. This is also the birth of the first ever paperwork. As the cities grew, the kings realized they had a problem. They could not remember who had paid their wheat taxes and who had not. They could not remember who owed what to whom. They could not keep track of the inventory in the grain silos. They needed a system. They needed a way to track data outside of human memory. So, around the year 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, we see the invention of writing. Now, this is going to disappoint you. The first writing was not poetry. It was not philosophy. It was not love letters or epic tales of heroism. The first ever written words in human history were literally accounting records. Receipts. 29,086 measures of barley. Signed, Kashim. That is it. That is the sentence. The first human whose name we know from history was not a warrior. He was not a prophet. He was not a king. He was an accountant. His name was Kashim, and his job was to count grain and write it down on clay tablets so the temple could keep track of who owed what. This is how writing was born. Out of taxes. Out of bureaucracy. Out of the need to manage an increasingly complex society that could no longer function on memory and trust alone. Writing changed everything. It allowed information to be stored. It allowed knowledge to be passed down across generations without distortion. It allowed kings to send orders across vast distances. It was the beginning of history as we know it. But let us be real. Living in the first cities was not glamorous. It sounds epic when we talk about it now, but for the average person living in a city like Eridu or Yor or Uruk, it was a horror movie. You were living in a mud hut, packed in tighter than a modern college dorm. There was no trash pickup. There were no sewers. People were throwing their waste into the streets. You were living next to your animals. Pigs, goats, chickens, cows, all crammed into the same tight quarters. You were living in a literal petri dish of disease. This is the era of the Great Plagues. Smallpox. Measles. Influenza. Tuberculosis. All of these diseases started jumping from domesticated animals into humans. If you were a city dweller in the year 4000 BC, your life expectancy plummeted compared to your hunter-gatherer ancestors. You were shorter because your diet was mostly grain and lacked the protein and nutrients that meat and wild plants provided. Your teeth were rotting out of your skull because you were eating bread and porridge all day, every day. And you were likely working 12 hours a day in the fields or in construction projects for a king who claimed he was a living god and demanded 20% of everything you produced. So why did not people just leave? Why did not they say, you know what, this sucks, I am going back to the forest? Because they could not. Outside the city walls was the wild. And the wild was now dangerous. It was not just wild animals anymore. It was other cities. Other kings. Other armies. If you left the protection of your city, you would likely be captured by a neighboring city and turned into a slave. Or you would be killed. Or you would starve because all the good land was already claimed by someone else. Humanity had accidentally built a cage. And we had locked ourselves inside. We traded the freedom of the open road for the safety of a wall. We traded autonomy for security. And once we made that trade, there was no going back. Despite the diseases, the inequality, the taxes, and the bossy kings who claimed to speak for the gods, the city trap worked. Because cities did one thing better than anything else in history. They accelerated ideas. When you pack 10,000 brains into 1 square mile, things happen. Innovations explode. Someone invents the wheel because they are tired of dragging heavy sleds through the mud. Someone else figures out that if you mix copper and tin together, you get bronze, which is way stronger than either metal alone. Someone else invents the plow, which allows you to farm way more land with way less effort. We became specialists. For 7 million years, every human knew how to do everything. We all knew how to make a fire, find water, track an animal, build a shelter, make tools. We were generalists. But in the city, you could be a baker. You could spend your entire life perfecting the art of bread. You could be a blacksmith and do nothing but forge metal. You could be a priest and spend all your time studying the stars and talking to the gods. You could even be a professional gossiper, which we now call a journalist. We sacrificed our individual self-sufficiency to become part of a collective superorganism. No single person in a city could survive alone. But together, as a group, we could build things that no hunter-gatherer tribe could ever dream of. Massive temples, pyramids, walls, armies, empires. Mesopotamia set the blueprint for the next 6,000 years of human history. The walls, the kings, the taxes, the bureaucracy, the hierarchy, the wars, the diseases, the inequality, and yes, even the drama. Because when you have thousands of people living in close quarters, you get gossip. You get scandals. You get political intrigue. You get the ancient equivalent of social media, which was just people talking trash about each other in the marketplace. We have not really changed that much. We're still just hairless primates trying to figure out how to live in a human anthill without losing our minds. Next time on the timeline, we are heading to Egypt, the land of the Nile, where they took the whole "king is a god" idea and turned it up to 11. Where they built the most iconic monuments in human history. And where they invented one of the most successful civilizations that ever existed. Subscribe to the timeline, and whatever you do, try not to let the storm god get you.